Today, it is such a privilege to introduce Secretary King. Mr. Secretary, you are simply one of the nation's most accomplished and effective education advocates in the country today, and we're so honored to have you here. As many of you know, the Secretary has very deep roots in New York, where both his parents were career New York City public school teachers, and of course, he served as the New York State Education Commissioner from 2011 to 2015. He was also a teacher in Puerto Rico and in Boston, and then, I would say, took on the hardest job in America, a middle school principal. At the Department of Education, the Secretary focused on increasing equity through improving educational outcomes for all students, closing the achievement gap through implementation of the administration's priorities such as early learning and education in elementary and secondary education, special education, English language acquisition, and innovation. During his tenure, the Century Foundation had the pleasure of co-hosting events with the Department of Education that brought together some of the nation's most innovative school districts looking to diversify their public schools, something that the Secretary took a leadership role in throughout his tenure. Today, the Secretary leads Education Trust, a national nonprofit advocacy organization that promotes high academic achievement for students at all levels. I am also proud to say that he is a distinguished board member of the Century Foundation, Secretary John King. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. It's good to be here with some old friends in the audience, and always good to be in New York. Thanks for the introduction, Mark, and thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this celebration of Janice's legacy and this opportunity for Philanthropy New York to come together to talk as a community about where we head next in education. Part of why it's such an honor to be a part of this conversation is because of the things that Dick talked about. Janice's commitment to education equity. It's exactly what Philanthropy New York is about. It's exactly what the Century Foundation is about, and it's what I have focused on throughout my career in education. Janice understood, importantly, that education is something that must be available to all. That regardless of race or class, we have to ensure that every young person has the opportunity to fulfill their potential. And I'd be mistaken not to start our conversation with the very real historical context in which we find ourselves and the challenge that we find to those very fundamental notions of equity at this moment in our country. I started out teaching high school social studies, so I always like to situate the conversation in that historical context, and this is surely a complicated historical moment. You think about the contrast between celebrating the legacy of Dr. King on Monday and then having the current president use the language he did in reference to countries around the world, countries of origin of so many Americans. That's where we are at this moment. I think about visiting a high school, Cardozo High School in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago, sitting with students who are in the international school there and asked them about their school year. And what I heard from students was Somali students who can't see their family because of the travel ban. Heard from students who are worried about DACA, worried about whether they or their families will be deported. Students who are worried about a tone in the country that negates their very humanity. That's the moment that we're at. Think about what's happening at the Education Department Office for Civil Rights. A 50-year legacy of civil rights enforcement that has said when there is a civil rights complaint, we not only look at that individual incident, we ask, are there systemic problems in this institution? And yet the Education Department today is walking away from that legacy, dismantling, really, the Office for Civil Rights. The administration's one of their first acts was to take away protections for transgender students, to go backwards on protecting the rights of LGBTQ students. It's one of the first things they did. Followed shortly thereafter by going backwards on protection against sexual assault on higher ed and K-12 campuses. And they now seem to be preparing to go backwards on efforts we made in the Obama administration to rethink the nation's approach to school discipline because of the disproportionate exclusionary discipline that students of color face in our schools. That's the moment we're in. We are also in a moment when the administration proposed a budget that eliminates federal support for teacher professional development. Not cuts, eliminates federal support for teacher professional development. Proposed a budget that eliminates federal funding for after-school and summer programs, a budget that cuts investments in higher education, makes it harder for young people to go to college, makes it harder for working adults and veterans to go to college and pursue higher education. That's the moment we're in. And so the challenge, I think, for all of us, some of the priorities I think we should set out for what we aspire to, because in these moments of challenge, we have to remind ourselves what it is that we are fighting for. And then I want to talk specifically about some of the things I think philanthropy can do. In terms of what I hope that we are fighting for, I hope that we are fighting together for the notion that every child deserves a well-rounded, well-supported, well-resourced education. And that means not just English and math. That means science and social studies and civic education. It means that we're going to support kids' socioemotional learning and give them opportunities to develop and grow as people. It means that we're going to give them school experiences that expose them to ideas and issues beyond their own community. It means we're going to ensure that all students have access to advanced coursework. We know, for example, from the Civil Rights Data Collection Survey that we do at the Education Department, they are required to do by statute, so they should continue to do it. But that data shows us that in many high schools serving low-income students and students of color in this country, you cannot even take physics or chemistry or algebra 2. And that has to offend all of us, that there are kids who go to a school where you can't even access the kinds of courses you would need if you were passionate about a STEM education. So, well-rounded, well-resourced education also means access to quality teachers. We know too often our kids who are most vulnerable get less access to effective teachers. They are more likely to be in schools with first-year teachers where there's tremendous teacher turnover. They are more likely to be in schools where teachers are struggling to support them. It's another example of how we give those who need the most the least. And a well-rounded, well-resourced education requires actual dollars. Right? And that sometimes can be an uncomfortable conversation because people don't want to acknowledge the degree to which we have tremendous resource inequities in this country. We did a report at the Education Trust that showed low-income students in school districts where low-income students go to school. On average, around the country, they're getting $1,200 less per student. And we know in New York, those gaps can be much larger. $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 differences, even up to $10,000 or $15,000 differences in the per pupil spending from one community to the next. We also know, shockingly, that it's actually worse in districts that serve large numbers of students of color. Oftentimes people will say, oh, well, the school resource question is a poverty question. Actually, it's a poverty and a race question. On average, districts that serve large numbers of African American and Latino students get about $2,000 less nationally. Right, so we are intentionally, systematically depriving those students who need the most support of access to resources. Second, in addition to that well-rounded, well-resourced education, we have to make sure that schools are safe and supportive environments for all of our kids. The Southern Poverty Law Center did a study last year surveying educators about school climate in their schools, particularly in the context of the tone that's being set by the current administration. 8 out of 10 educators reported heightened anxiety among their LGBTQ students, among their African American students, their Latino students, their Muslim students, and their immigrant students. In that same study, 4 out of 10 educators reported that they did not believe their school had a strategy in place to respond to incidents of hate or bias. What does that say about the safety in our schools, the emotional safety for our students? We also know through work that Ed Trust New York has done, our office here in New York, that there are school districts that are refusing to adequately serve their immigrant students, despite efforts by the State Education Department here and the State Attorney General's office. There are school districts that still, when an immigrant family comes to enroll, will say, come back next week and bring these forms that are actually illegal to require. Or school districts that will say, you know, GED programs are the same thing as high schools here. Why don't we enroll your child in a GED program? Right? Still today, denial of fundamental rights by school districts. We can and must do better. That's a matter of school safety. It's a matter of school climate. It is a matter of whether or not we create schools that honor each of our students as individuals. We also know, I mentioned the challenge of exclusionary discipline as the department readies to undo the guidance that we put out in the Obama administration around school discipline. It's worth considering how bad the situation is in schools. African American students make up 18% of the students in pre-K, 48% of the students who are suspended from pre-K. Suspended, 4-year-olds. African American students in K through 12 are more than three times as likely to be suspended from school. And we know if you go district by district, including New York, you will find districts where African American students are suspended at 4, 5, 6 times the rate of white students. And it's not just, sometimes people think it's just about boys of color, African American, Latino boys. No, in fact, in many places, the disparity is wider for African American and Latina female students who are being suspended at rates 5, 6, 7 times the rate at which white students are suspended. And we know those suspensions are the entry point to the school to prison pipeline. We also know from the Civil Rights Data Collection Survey that I mentioned, we have 1.6 million kids who go to a high school in the United States where there's a sworn law enforcement officer and no school counselor. Right? Imagine what message that sends to young people. Right? And imagine what that means for kids' socio-emotional learning if the response in a school to students who are struggling with socio-emotional needs, students who've experienced trauma, the response is law enforcement rather than socio-emotional support. Right? That's an unwillingness on our part to invest the necessary resources in making schools safe, supportive environments for our kids. And we know what needs to happen. We know, we have evidence from around the country of places that are using restorative justice, that are doing implicit bias training with teachers, that are rethinking their approach to discipline, lowering the use of exclusionary discipline, and improving student outcomes. It is doable, but it's a question of political will. Prepares to go backwards on that issue. So we need that well-rounded, well-resourced education. We need safe and supportive environments. And we need environments, and this is particularly important to talk about this week. We need environments that ensure our students have access to diverse communities of learners. That means in terms of the students and the teachers. In terms of the students, we know that many places around the country, schools are as segregated or more segregated than they were 10 or 20 years ago. Many places, sadly, are as segregated as they were when the Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education. And sometimes people will say, oh, well, that's a housing problem. But in fact, New York City gives us a prime example that is not simply a housing problem. In Brooklyn, where I grew up, you can find neighborhoods where the schools are actually significantly more segregated than the housing. Right? That's a choice that we've made. A recent study did a national analysis looking at how district lines are drawn and how school attendance zones are drawn. And what it showed is, in place after place around the country, we are making the choice by how we set up attendance zones for schools to segregate our kids. And we're making that choice as a society. Despite the rhetoric around Brown, the rhetoric around Dr. King's birthday, we're making the choice to segregate our schools. It doesn't have to be that way. And one of the important areas of work for the Century Foundation, one of the things I love about the Century Foundation has been the longstanding commitment to work on school diversity and to show people that something different is possible. Century Foundation, an excellent report on over 100 communities around the country that are working on voluntary school integration efforts, dual language programs, magnet arts and STEM programs, creative attendance zones, right? Saying instead of two segregated K-5 schools, one that's almost entirely white and affluent and one that is almost entirely students of color and low income, why not have a K through 2 school and a 3 through 5 school? And in those schools, create racially and socioeconomically diverse communities. In fact, I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside of DC, and our county has had a decades-long commitment to integrated housing and integrated schools. And one of the things I love about my kids' experience in Montgomery County schools is that they are in schools where they are continuously exposed to diverse student populations. When we first moved there, my daughter plays softball. She came off the softball field, and I said to her, "Oh, your softball team is fantastic. It's like a Benetton ad," to which my daughter responded, "What is Benetton?" So that didn't quite land with her as it might with a somewhat older audience, but I'm inspired continually. My younger daughter now is in a middle school that's about a quarter black, a quarter Latino, a quarter Asian, a quarter white. And that's reflected, it's not perfect, but that's reflected largely in her classes and in her experience of the community, that level of diversity. It's not perfect. There's lots of things Montgomery County could do better, but we could have that. But we choose in many communities not to have that by how we set up school attendance. But it's not just a problem around students, it's also a problem around teachers. So Ed Trust New York, and we have Ian Rosenblum, our executive director from Ed Trust New York here, did this powerful study on teacher diversity in New York, showing that for tens of thousands of our African American and Latino students in New York State, they are in schools where there is not a single teacher or principal of color. Right? In fact, the study showed that in 1/3 of our schools, there are no Latino or Black teachers, and that 10% of our Latino and African American students are in schools without a single teacher of the same race or ethnicity. And that is a problem, and I would argue that's a problem not just for kids of color, because kids of color need to see teachers and leaders of color in the classroom. And we know from a recent study that Johns Hopkins did, a huge data set in North Carolina, that for African American elementary school students to have one African American teacher made a tremendous impact on their long-term academic success. They actually are more likely to graduate from high school if they had had one African American teacher in elementary school. So we know it matters for kids of color, but I would argue it also matters for white kids. It's important for white kids to see teachers and principals of color in their schools and communities. And it's hard to be racist if you're learning calculus from a Black teacher, right? If you're a white kid who's learning calculus from a Black teacher, when somebody says, well, Black people aren't as smart as white people, you're gonna think twice about that, right? The experience of seeing a diverse adult community support your learning is a powerful one, and we are depriving our kids of that in many communities. In fact, in that Ed Trust New York study, nearly half of all white students in New York are enrolled in schools without a single Black or Latino teacher. Right? So our work has to focus on student diversity, but we also have work to do on teacher diversity as well. So well-resourced, well-supported, safe, supportive environments, and diverse schools. That seems like a reasonable agenda for education, but we're so far from that. We have so much work to do. So what's the role of philanthropy? And I'll just end with a couple thoughts on that. One is, I think it's important for philanthropy to engage not just on direct service, but on policy. Now, there's a risk that sounds self-interested because Ed Trust does policy, Century Foundation does policy, but the reality is the government spends billions of dollars every year at the city, state, and federal level. There's so much leverage in moving those dollars. And so thinking about how philanthropy can leverage those dollars through policy change is, I think, a powerful and often missed opportunity. Frankly, I talk to many foundation folks who say, we love the policy work that you're doing, but we don't do policy. We just do direct service. But at the end of the day, the things we care about will move if we can move the policy agenda. Right? Think about an issue like homelessness. We just did a study at EdTrust New York on students who are homeless. We know that you can have two schools serving significant numbers of homeless students with dramatically different outcomes. Right? It often comes down to what kinds of supports are in place within a given school for their students who are homeless. Right? What efforts is the school making to meet their needs? Now, as a philanthropy, you could invest in a direct service in a single school. But the government is spending billions of dollars on schools. And so why not try to move the policy so that we have a policy agenda that focuses schools and communities on better serving and supporting our homeless students and their families? So investing in policy. Second, focusing on equity. And everyone in this room probably would say that they care about equity. But the reality is, on issue after issue, we know that students of color, low-income students, English learners, immigrant students are getting less. And so we got to think about how do we use philanthropy as a lever to focus people on those equity questions and to think about the most vulnerable students, the homeless kids, the foster youth. Right? When you think about, and those two communities overlap, right? Even though we know for a foster kid, we know exactly the moment at which they will be on their own, yet foster kids are dramatically overrepresented amongst our homeless youth population. That's a systemic failure. It's because we're not paying attention. So foster kids, homeless kids, kids who are in juvenile justice facilities. In too many places, being involved in the juvenile justice system isn't just about addressing something that happened as a juvenile. It ends up being a ticket to long-term incarceration as an adult. It doesn't have to be that way, and we've got to be willing to focus on the needs of those most vulnerable students. I'm convinced that if we start out with serving the most vulnerable students, we'll do well by everybody. Right? And too often in policy conversations, whether it's in Washington or in Albany, that I've been a part of, the conversation starts with the affluent white middle-class student in the suburbs. And then people are like, oh yeah, what about English learners again? What are we going to do for them? Right? As the afterthought, what if we reverse that? What if we started with the kids who are most at risk and built systems from there? Third, I think we have to be careful about unintended consequences of policies, particularly when we don't adequately consider equity at the outset. One area I'm particularly concerned about at the moment is the enthusiasm around socio-emotional learning, which I love and care about. But I worry. I have a friend who's a New York City teacher, New York City teaching fellow teacher, and he was telling me about a colleague who said, you know, my kids aren't doing this that well this year, but you know, it's because they're not gritty enough. You know, my students, they don't have the grit they need. And I thought to myself, that is such a perversion of the task of schools, right? We're supposed to be building our students up, not coming up with new reasons to blame students, right? And so there's a real danger as we talk about socio-emotional learning that if we don't tackle issues of implicit bias, if we don't have an honest conversation about structural inequity, that will become yet another way that we blame students and families for their situation. Fourth, importantly, is philanthropy that's focused on K-12 connecting to other institutional actors that affect students and their life outcomes. I think about the debate right now in Congress about CHIP, right? If we have a whole set of lower income kids who don't have access to healthcare, their academic performance will suffer. Healthcare isn't separate from education. Healthcare is an education issue. Right? And so we've got to be active, those of us who care about K-12, on the healthcare fight. But we also have to think about K-12 in the context of post-secondary opportunities. The City University of New York is a tremendous driver of social mobility, but we could be doing so much better of a job connecting what students are doing in high school with their experiences that we hope they will have in post-secondary. And investing in our post-secondary institutions so that they are truly student-ready. We know, for example, that the CUNY ASAP program, designed to provide additional supports to students who are required to take remedial courses, can double graduation. Right? Take community college graduation from in the 20s to in the 40s, right? Through an investment in better counseling, better advising, just-in-time grants, Metro cards, right? We should have that program on every CUNY campus. But we don't, because we aren't willing to make the political investment followed by the financial investment. And there's a role that philanthropy can play there. So I will stop there. I will close with W.E.B. Du Bois, because I think it's important for us to sort of grapple with what is our personal responsibility in this moment. And one of the things Du Bois said that I love, now is the accepted time, not tomorrow, not some more convenient season. It is today that our best work can be done, and not some future day or future year. It is today that we fit ourselves for the greater usefulness of tomorrow. Today is the seed time. Now are the hours of work, and tomorrow comes the harvest. That was the spirit that it sounds like Janice approached her work in philanthropy with. I hope that's the spirit in which we approach this conversation and the work that each of us does. Thanks.